Okay, hi everyone, and welcome back to a Breaking the Spell episode. And today we have a special guest with us today to talk about all sorts of issues, a little bit locally in Singapore. So it pertains to the poor, the low-income families, and other social issues. So our guest today is Suraendher Kumarr. So he's actually a researcher at Beyond Social Services, which is an organization that does community work with rental flat residents. He also serves as a board member of Home, which is an organization that focuses on migrant labor issues. In 2020, he also co-organized the Activism in Crisis Festival to build stronger links between environmental and other social justice organizations. Prior to that, Kumar was also involved with Group Reading Community, which organized social political book clubs across Singapore. And in 2019, as a member of CAPE in NUS, he also co-organized a movement to address sexual offences on campus. So that's formally who Kumar is, but really on a personal note, some of us here, we have known Kumar a little bit through his work, and we felt that he's a really interesting guy to have on the show to talk about all sorts of issues. And although this is really quite, although it may seem like, these issues are locally centered in Singapore, but quite honestly, we do think that these issues just cut across different countries and cultures. So even if you're an international viewer, I think you'll find many of the issues that we talk about just as pertinent. Yeah. So Kumar, thanks for coming on our show. So we kickstart our sessions usually with asking our guests, what made you realize that the world is not the way it should be?
Right. Wow, that's a loaded question. But I think it might help to start like by knowing who I am first, right? So for example, like I was I grew up housing insecure, meaning that didn't really have a stable home. A lot of it had to do with class, coming from a working class background and coming from a single parent family as well. There was a lot of housing insecurity. So from a very young age, I had to understand a little bit about housing policy, a little bit about welfare policies and all that, just so that we can have food on the table. But at the same time, my young self is limited in understanding the full extent of what was going on. And it's very easy to accept reality as it is in order to cope every day. So I kind of internalized a lot of what we take as common sense in I don't think just Singapore, but in the world, that, for example, if you're poor, you're lazy, and that if you, and it boils down to the fact that you don't have educated parents and you don't, and the state doesn't owe you anything, and no one owes you anything, right? It's all about the individual. It's about how hard you work. It's about, if you work hard, you wouldn't be in this rut. So I think where I always did find a sense of instability, like mentally, like psychologically, but also I think physically, right? I think it shows in your health as well. When you're not sure whether is this your fault, is this your parents' fault, why? And the best part was that I was I mean, compared to a lot of my siblings, I was more interested. I mean, I somehow performed better in academics, and so I was able to somewhat relatively thrive in the education system. So I was able to get bursaries, and that took a load off from my single mom, because she didn't need to work. So she still worked many jobs, but she wasn't focused on, let's say, like paying for my education, because I benefited from the bursaries and all that. So I do have to say that if you are inclined to the kind of rote education, the kind of common education that we have in Singapore, then it's not terribly difficult. It still is. The stakes are still very high, and because of that, I generally did not have a problem in school. Generally did not. I also had very kind teachers who I think were like some of my role models at first. Like they said that they didn't want education to. They didn't want me to think of money as a obstacle for education. So I remember one of my teachers paid for my O levels. One of them paid for my A levels. Like, and these are like a few $100s, right? And yeah, they just said they did paid for it without even telling me, right? And then I found out later, I was like, whoa, okay, yeah. So there was a lot of these like acts of generosity that I benefited from, and I can't say the same for a lot of other people. I mean, you have to be really lucky to have such teachers, and you have to be, and I think you also have to strike a chord with your teacher. So, for example, if you're a bit of a delinquent, right, and naturally it's quite easy to be a delinquent when you feel like you're to blame, or like your parents are to blame for the rut you're in. So it's kind of I was kind of lucky in that way, and I also had I come from a family of like I have 4 other siblings, so and I'm the 4th child, so I was able to learn from the mistakes and the great things that my elder siblings did. And so in a way, I had like, yeah, of course, I didn't have like a stable father figure, but I also had like many father figures in the form of my brothers, and also like many motherly figures in the form of my older sister. So I think when I read, and I never really read anything or met anything that made me realize, hey, yo, like the world isn't the way it should be, or that there's something wrong with the way the world works. It was only, I think, when I went to, it was kind of creeping, right? I think like in secondary school a little bit, in junior college a little bit as well. But and in NS, I don't think I had national service. I didn't really have that kind of sensing. But it was in university, I think, that I met with some friends, and then I ended up doing political science. I was debating whether I should do political science or literature. I like literature. I enjoyed reading fiction. But then I had this very Singaporean mindset, right? Like, oh, literature, how are you gonna get a job, that kind of thing. And not to say like I mean, now that I graduated, I'm like, actually both the prospects are the same, right? so at the end, I just had this idea, like, okay, if I do political science, I'll join the civil service. I'll just be a bureaucrat, and that's kind of like my career set for me, right? Just work really hard, go into Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and like just be one of those bureaucrats. So that's what I thought, right? And so I ended up doing political science, and I it wasn't the curriculum in political science in NUS, far from it. A lot of the curriculum in political science in NUS is very functional. I think that's the word, very functional. It's the curriculum there is designed for us to be, I think, very apt civil servants. It is a little bit. So the Singapore politics course, for example, it doesn't allow for much criticism. I had a very good TA, teaching assistant, and he exposed us to a lot of texts that weren't in the main core syllabus, and those things were a bit more critical. And I think that's important for any human being to, like, decide for yourself rather than be told what to think. So for me, it wasn't even that. It was it was actually a book. Not just a book, but it was a particular thinker, Noam Chomsky, right? It was Noam Chomsky. So he's an American author, right? And he writes a lot. He writes talks. He's a linguist, but I think his fame came about during the Vietnam War, and I think like his article, I think the responsibility of the intellectuals, I think it was that, and I think that it was not that piece particularly, but reading his other stuff that was critical of U.S. empire and the media industry, manufacturing consent, for example, that kind of blew my mind for a bit, and that was like a gateway to like a lot of other like anti-imperialist sort of texts that led me into like other political thinkers as well. And I think that's when I started realizing that, hey, wait a minute, okay, so the system we live in, right, is this thing called capitalism, and the system we live in, we are also kind of under imperialism, right? And imperialism, as some would say, is the highest form of capitalism. So like this system is a name to it, right? And it's not common sense. It's not the way the world has always been, and it's not the way the world is. There were other visions as well, right? There were paths untaken, right? And there were also like world making, right? There were African countries, leaders that were also world making. There were also Southeast Asian leaders during the 50s, right, the 60s, who were also had different visions, right? Some would, I guess, attribute some sort of socialism to that kind of and socialism is a very broad field, right? There's so many different types of socialism, and so I think that's what made me realize that, like, oh wait, there is actually another way this could work. And I think from there branched out a lot of like critical works. And so I wouldn't say that it was purely like academia or like theory, but I think it was the particular like class position that I'm in, that when theory came about, like when I interacted with theory, that sort of like just clicked in my head, like, oh yeah, that's kind of like what's going on. And sort of like for me, that was a very important intervention in my own mind, because before that, like I used to be very convoluted in my writing. I used to be very unsure, and I don't know why, right? But I think after that, something just clicked in me, and I realized, okay, I kind of know what I believe in. I know who I am, right? And then I think it showed more in my writing. And so like my time in university was the best time I had in terms of academics. Like I never performed better like before that. Like, and I think it's because of clarity and just how like how confusing everything was when so many things were hidden. And I say that in the sense that because when I went to university, then like, you know, I had this time and space when you're able to craft your own research questions and stuff like that. You're able to, like, you know, be a bit curious, and you understand so many things about Singapore history that you never really knew before, and you also understand things about world history that you never really knew before. You start questioning narratives and all that. And that space, I think, is very important, not just for like I mean, nothing to do with politics or nothing to do with big world kind of like change or like none of that. It's just for the personal individual, like for your own sanity of mind. It's so important to make that decision yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, wow, you covered a lot of ground. But anyway, thanks for saying all that, because actually there's a lot of areas that we want to pick on. So things like your experiences in the educational system. I was just going to introduce you also as someone who's made the dean's list for 2 years running. You talk about Noam Chomsky, again, another major influential figure also for me. And yeah, you know, actually similar to you, it was also when I was I studied in Australia, so I was in University of Melbourne, and that's where I got introduced to Noam Chomsky. And not through my formal studies, actually. I just picked up his book at the bookstore, and you know, the book was on sale, and I just thought, oh, who's this guy? And I just started reading it, and the book was called Understanding Power: The Indispensable Guide to Noam Chomsky. And you know, it was also from there that I had I like to steal Hume, the philosopher David Hume's quote when he talked about Immanuel Kant, that he woke him up from his nomadic slumbers, and that's what Noam Chomsky did for me as well. So anyway, that's my experience. Ong Suen Santosh, you want to come in a little bit as to how you react to Kumar's background?
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing all that. I mean, it's such a rich personal narrative. I was actually really interested in how you said you were originally interested in literature as well. And I mean, so much of what you've been talking about is just the power of narratives and stories, and how, like, in your early life, you had just internalized all these narratives that you had been fed. I don't have a question just yet. Just yet, that's just my kind of reflection on hearing what you were talking about. Santosh?
No, I think it's a tremendous privilege to have you here on Breaking the Spell. I think there are several spells to be broken in just today's episode, and I would like to know what are some myths or spells that we need to break in our society, and what are new narratives that we'll like to rewrite, both at the level of political ideology as well as policy. Yeah, and I would like to, what can we rewrite? Yeah, given your experience and your understanding of the underlying myths and narratives, I think it's time that we rewrite some of these narratives and spells. Yeah, we break some spells and we create new, healthier spells. Yeah, or we free ourselves from spells. Yeah.
Right. Should I answer that now?
Yeah, actually, why not just give kind of like a brief, because I have with my questions for you, right? Like kind of a wish list of 5 policies. But before we even talk about that, perhaps can you identify 2 or 3 spells that Santosh, you know, has mentioned that you would like to talk about, and then we can try to focus on that.
Okay.
You mentioned capitalism, so that's definitely one
Yeah.
area to get into. Imperialism as well.
Right. I think in terms of spells, I think in particularly in Singapore, I think one spell I would like to unpack and break is the power of the collective, right? It's the power of and the thing about agency, right? The thing about agency in Singapore is very interesting, and this is something maybe it's a bit of it's a criticism, I think, of also civil society to some extent. And I mean, I am part of it, right? Also, like civil society is a very weird concept that not weird, but it's a very, I mean, we don't call it the left, right? In Singapore, we call it civil society, and it's because, I mean, Indonesia does the similar thing, and there's one thing in common we have in Indonesia, and that is that that is that shadow of the anti-communist crackdown, and both in places where communism and Marxism was very, very strong, right? I mean, in Singapore, it's not really clear how strong communism and Marxism was, but it was very strong, hard left, right? A very hard organized left in the form of Barisan Socialis and all that. But so I think that's what's in common. But I think Indonesia still has a very organized left comparatively to like Singapore, and the reason why I think is the success, I think, of the state in sort of accounting for. I mean, you have to give credit, I think, to the Singapore government for like being able to address popular pressure. And it does that because it has to, in order to remain in power, and it addresses it in a certain way that it contains. It's a form of containment of grievances, right? And I mean, I talk a lot about this in my bachelor's thesis in relation to migrant workers, but it's really drawn from a lot of Gary Rodin. I don't know if you've read Gary Rodin's work, but yeah. So Gary Rodin's work is he wrote this book called Participation Without Democracy in 2019, but it's really like a rehash of his work, I think in 2007 or 2013, where he came up with a framework called modes of participation, right? And the idea is that there is different modes of participation that are available in not just Singapore, but Southeast Asia in general, but he focuses on Singapore. And these modes of participation, for example, REACH, right, reach, you have, he also sees the NMP system as a nominated member of parliament system as a mode of participation as well. And I mean, and I kind of like was trying to, I don't know whether he does this, but another scholar, Charan Palbal, someone I know personally as well, like he also used Rodin's framework to understand the state control of migrant worker politics, right? And looking at places like Home, TWC2, they are a specific type of civil society space that is independent, but independent from state control, but it is individualized. It's not collectivized, right? You come in there with individual grievances, and there's a casework done. So he kind of argues that or rather, Rodin argues that these frameworks that we have, in a way, you can see space, right? It's kind of like a space for demonstrating some sort of politics, some sort of like state society type of politics, for society to leverage on some politics. And a lot of this is co-opted by the state. And in that way, and these are not totally, they cannot be totally unsuccessful. They have to be somewhat successful, right? And they have been somewhat successful for workers to come in to file their labor grievances, not as a union, not as a collective entity, but as like casework, right? And we do the same thing with VWOs. So that's something I wrote in this student journal. It was around the same time I was writing for my thesis. And I think that sadly the student journal doesn't exist anymore. So that article is kind of like scrubbed off the internet. But it's titled Politics of Controlling Labor in Singapore. And I also talked about VWOs. And this is interestingly before I joined Beyond, right? But interestingly, I had conversations with people in VWOs, and they also generally agreed that it was quite true, because VWOs are another site of, it's another space, another site of state control of, or I wouldn't say control. Control sounds very nefarious or very, very scary, but it's not. It's I mean, rather use a more value neutral term, like it's just state containment.
Management.
Right? Yeah, state management. Yeah, I think that's a good word, state management. And it manages these grievances so that it doesn't go haywire. So the question I start the article with is, why is it that Singapore, you have somewhat rising inequality based on some data? We actually do have many labor issues, but why is it that, in contrast to, at that time when I was writing, it was the Gilets Jaunes, I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it right, but the yellow vest protest in France. So I said basically Paris is burning, but how come in Singapore, where we have similar sort of labor issues as well, you don't see labor unrest, or you barely see it. You see it, I mean, there are, but there are episodes, they're hardly like ever protracted or anything. And so then my argument was that it was because actually of a lot of state factors that were actually quite successful. And it particularly had to do with containing labor grievances to ensure that they're individualized, firstly, and secondly, like all these spaces for all these like actually successful mechanisms to articulate it and get some sort of redressal, they all have some sort of state control in it. Home and TWC2 is another example, because yes, I mean, Home and TWC2 they are generally independent sites of participation, but the system is such that whenever a case goes to Home, for example, I can speak for Home because I did my internship there and I'm a board member there. So like when you go and seek a case there, ultimately what we're trying to do as caseworkers is we're trying to funnel them, like find the right way for it to be a case that is accepted by MOM, the state, that is accepted, and then it goes through the settlement agreement and all that. And throughout this whole time, you're reproducing state power, right? And when you're doing that, you're kind of like, hey, like the more you go into it, and the more you actually think that this is the best option I have, the more you kind of believe that, hey, you know, the state is like on my side, and the state wants to help me. And whether that's true or not, it's not really in the scope of what I want to talk about today. But that's kind of like what I think perpetuates this spell that the individual, when they come together, it's irrelevant. You don't do it. Like just as if you have an individual file a complaint, right, and let the state handle it, right? If it doesn't work, it means like you just didn't file a good case, right? And I think that it prevents collective action. It prevents collective, just even a possibility, a collective desire for collectivity. It prevents that. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it really, really prevents that. NOC saga, for example, people have been talking about the night owl cinematics and all that. I mean, I don't understand half the thing that's going on there, but what I do understand,
I can explain.
that'll be great, yeah. But what I do understand is the workplace abusers, right? And it's interesting to see how several entities, media entities like Vulcan Post and like Mothership and all these different entities have come out to put out articles to say that if you have, sometimes, you know, making this public is not helpful at all, and actually you should just go to MOM and file a case. Like a lot of these things are things, and actually what this does, I mean, they might be right, and they probably are right, if you want to address that grievance. But the problem is that it actually keeps making us feel disempowered as individuals coming together. It's like, oh, we can't make change ourselves. We can't take this on our own. So the thing is, I actually think that like the state mechanisms, I mean, of course we want the state mechanisms to be successful so that we can get our salary, so that we can get our pay and all that. But how do we also carve out a space for realizing that we are also capable of making our own change, and we don't always have to rely on the state as an agent of change, but how can we be agents of change? And I always find like talking about agency in Singapore very, very tricky, because when you run up against civil society, right? Civil society spaces, all that, there's always this distinction between structure and agency. Like there are structural factors that make us this way, right? And therefore, like agency, agential factors don't weigh in a lot. And that is important to consider as well, right? I mean, it's usually both, but you see, so the problem with the overemphasis, I think, on structural factors is that if we don't allow space to talk about, if we don't allow space for organizing, for expanding our capacity to take action as a collective, then it's very difficult. We're kind of playing into the state narrative that, like, okay, ultimately all we want is just policy changes, and like the state will continue changing, and it's just this relationship where it's reforms coming from above rather than coming from below, and the state is so it's like we are kind of like trusting the state to change because they have a good heart and they understand reason and all that kind of stuff. But I think like what's more important is this collective desire for collectivity. I think that's important. Yeah.
Okay, I have several comments. So I in hearing your story, there was this anecdotal experience I had. So I can't diverge too much, like, as to the specifics. But basically, I was in a closed door session, and there were very prominent Minister of States in this closed door discussion, and it was something to do with the rights of children. So let's put it that way. And I was actually a bit astonished because what happened was during the Q&A session. So a lot of the session's content was really just the speakers themselves just delivering their usual routine about, we'll do a lot for children, blah blah blah. But when it came to the Q&A session, it was made up of social workers. So these are not like radical activists. These are people who do work in civil society. And one woman came up and she said something, I can't remember it now because it's too long ago, but she essentially asked a very strong question about what are you doing for special needs children. And I remember the audience just applauding her. And I thought that was just such a embarrassing moment actually for the ministers or the state of heads that were there, because I guess they thought that this would be a very welcoming, accommodating audience, but it wasn't. It was actually social workers themselves who were, trying to speak up and try to resist the narrative that was being spewed in that session. And I mean, it impressed me a lot that actually, I guess when they felt like their voice was not being heard, they could actually. This woman acted as a representative in some sense. Like, she spoke for the feelings that they had. But going back to what you said about agency and all that, right? Like, I don't think the question is perplexing. I mean, if these social workers, for example, try to organize and try to come up with a petition or try to put up a collective statement, perhaps about what they see as pitfalls of a certain policy, I mean, they're going to get rebuked, and I suspect they may even face workplace repercussions, right? So I think that is the issue we have in Singapore. And obviously we have a rich history of worker organizers just meeting really, really unfortunate ends, let's put it that way. So I think there's always this fear of collective organization. So that's always there. It's persistent, it's and pervasive. So that is definitely one of the stumbling blocks that we have. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, oh yeah, go ahead, Winston, sorry.
I was, there's a lot in what you said, and I was wondering if, like, one way to describe this spell that you want to break, in a crisp and concise manner, would it be just this phenomena of atomization and fracturing of society, which the state kind of has an influence on, like it, through these structures, it creates this phenomena in society where we're just individuals and atoms. And to some extent, I also think the way was paved by consumerism. I think consumerism is also like kind of conditions us to think as individuals, and the only way we kind of band together as consumers is under a brand, which is such a superficial way of being a collective. And really, like, what we need, what is lacking is, as you said, this space where we can come together as more complex individuals with so many different dimensions of needs and desires and wants. And we recently had on this show Imran Taib, who's an interface scholar, and I feel, like we need more people like him that have the ability to convene diverse people and to create spaces where we can have a much richer and more meaningful conversation about, these topics that concern us.
Before you go into that, Kumar and Santosh, I just want to say maybe I would like to talk about this also later on in our session. Because Angsu, you just mentioned something about having more conversations, right? And I just had like epiphany like last night. I think I was watching the news, and the news, like, it was half an hour of like, oh, Singapore is doing this, Singapore is doing that, and a lot of it centered on because of the upcoming COP26, which is the climate change international meeting, and it just struck me, right? Like, we have a lot of conversations going on, and I'm actually feeling very what's the word for it? Nihilistic about this whole idea that, oh, we just need more conversations. Let's have conversations here. Let's have conversations there. I'm very interested to hear from you, Kumar, whether you think, are we actually just running up a brick wall, trying to insist that there's a solution, which is just having more conversations. But in the first place, the state doesn't facilitate it because it's not open anyway, and not democratic for sure. And then also, like, are we just trying to talk our way out of a problem, and really what we need is action? So yeah. Go ahead. Sorry for jumping in that way.
Yeah. No, I mean, thanks, Douglas and also for those. It really made me think. So, like, what is my opinion on that? Because there is this thing that I personally suffer from, which is conversation fatigue, and we have it a lot in certain workplaces that I've been in, and the thing is, the reason why there's the fatigue is because it's like, was there a point to this, and I guess it depends on the conversation. What is it doing? So I mean, I guess I can speak a little bit abstractly about conversations towards action, right? Like Douglas, what you were talking about, like we should just have action. I mean, I do think you need to have conversations before you have action, and it depends on what the kind of action is. So when I talk about the desire for like collective action, I do think like you need to have some conversations with people who will move things in order for it to happen. I mean, I can speak from experience about how we organized that campaign in NUS. It was the Monica Bay case, and like how did we organize a petition like that? It was quite a big thing at that time. I mean, now it sounds like, okay, you just have a petition, a few hundred people sign from the college. It's not a big deal, but it was kind of a big deal at that time because it was 2019. It was my year I was graduating, and actually NUS had not done something like that, probably decades. In my time I was there, we had never like put our names, our faculty and all that in like not a change.org petition, but like a petition where we actually asked people to send us their names, right? And we did it all in secret. Like, I didn't say that I was organizing it at that time. I only am brave enough to say it now because I graduated and I have a job. Yeah, but that's the fear that we had. A lot of us just felt that, like, if we get revealed as the organizers, then like, what will really happen? Like now, I mean, Yale NUS is a different story. So I'm from NUS, and Yale NUS is a bit of a different culture with collective action. It has a very different culture, and I can't speak to that much, but we did interact with that. I think we had some interactions with Yale NUS through another organization that you mentioned, Douglas, that I was in, Kate, right? And yeah, I think knowing the Yale NUS, what was going on, like, expanded our horizons a little bit, and we thought that, hey, like, I think for me it was a lot of male guilt that I felt, right? As a guy, what was I doing about the issue? And I didn't know a whole lot about feminism at that time. I don't think I know a whole lot now either. But the thing is, like, I think the best way of learning is to get involved, right? And it doesn't take any theory or text to understand that what happened to Monica Bay was just wrong, right? And perhaps,
sorry,
yes.
Kumar, can you share a little bit, because maybe some people don't know what is this case about? Yeah.
Sure. So what happened, I think, in 2019 was that this student, she was my junior, I think she was second year or something. I think I was graduating fourth year. I didn't know her personally, but this case blew up. That this student, female student, Monica Bay, was filmed in the shower by this other male student. And this was, she was enraged by this. She found this. She knew who the guy was. She saw him, and she blasted this on Instagram, and it blew up virally. And people were angry, and people were asking. People were just really, really frustrated. Most of them were women, and just women, non-binary people and trans people who were just very, very frustrated about this and saying that this is not the first time. And some people started coming out to say like this happened to me, and stuff like that. It was kind of like our Me Too moment in NUS. And the thing is, like, people all say that NUS is full of pearls. It's probably true, but the thing is, like, it's not a new phenomenon. Like, it's probably been there for a very long time. What happened with, like, Monica Bay broke the seal, right? When she went out to say that, then you saw this. Like, I was in the town hall where somebody that I knew, right, in my residential college, I knew her for a long time. I always found her very soft-spoken. I never understood why. She stood up in front of hundreds of people and talked about her experience, about her sexual assault. And that takes a lot of bravery. And I think what we witnessed in that town hall, and not just the town hall, but the process of getting the signatures, putting it out, and all that, and seeing things move as happening. It all happened like when I was about to graduate. I was like, oh man, now only when I'm graduating, right? This kind of collective action, like, it was great to see. It was there's this term that Jodie Dean, like this scholar, likes to use a lot. She cites someone, I can't remember who it is, but this discharge of equality or something like that. That's what I felt, right? Toyo Yen used another word, collective effervescence, to describe the Aware Saga. What it felt like. I don't know if that's what I felt, but I did felt this sense of equality, that we could all suddenly make change, that we could all like do something. We were coming out of the town hall, which was private. They didn't let the media in. But what we did was, I just thought students were so creative, right? They were like, okay, town hall is happening privately, right? Well, I'll just live tweet it. So people were live tweeting, and basically it was an open town hall, and people could know what was going on. And they did the same thing with the Yale NUS closure. Right, and it's just that so we had to have conversations that were rooted in an issue that we really wanted to solve. We had the stakes that we were having these conversations with people who had stakes in it, and these were issues that we knew what we were talking about, and we were trying to find an alternative plan. There were a lot of mistakes. There were so many things I wish we could have done differently. Right. For example, like, I look back at the petition that we wrote. So the petition we wrote was like. The funny story is that it actually started out as a letter that I wanted to write to the president, the NUS management, because I was feeling a lot of male guilt. And like, there was this friend of mine, female friend, who was like, if you're and she just posted this on Instagram. She's like, if you're a guy, right, and you're not like, and you're angry about this, but you're not doing anything about it, then what are you doing with your privilege and all that? And that hit me hard. I was like, yeah, what am I doing? Right. Then I was like, okay, I'll go and write a letter. But I didn't know how to write it. I didn't know how to articulate what was wrong with this, right? So I was writing, and I asked a couple of friends to like, hey, can you come and check out my letter, see whether there's any issues. Then this person invited somebody else who knows more about feminism, and then another person invited somebody else. And next thing you know, there are 20 people on the door, and suddenly it just turned into a petition, right? And then that was kind of like how it happened, but a lot of coordination after that, collecting the signatures, also sleepless nights. People had exams, but people didn't care. We studied for our exams anyway, right? I got a name for that module. Okay, so I got it. So that the myth that like, people who organize are not good at studies is nonsense. Okay, it actually helps. It actually helps. Rosa Luxemburg, I just want to say this quote, right? Rosa Luxemburg, one of my favorite thinkers, she said that the mass strike is the best form of political education. And I think you can abstract that. I mean, in Singapore, we can't legally strike without the union, which is controlled by the state, without their approval. Actually, even without we can't even strike without employers' approval. But I think like the you can abstract from that and say mass action is also a very good form of political education. And I tell you, like, I could go to courses on feminism and all that, but I learned so much about feminism and gender equality. I have not read a lot of feminist texts, but like being involved in that action, I was able to see it, and there were people who read it, and in this way, I think like the role of intellectualism is also important. You do need to have intellectuals in movements, in organizations, to interpret what was going on, right? And that was helpful. So like, I think that was how, for me, like, conversations geared towards an action is important. And I think leadership is also important, like a leader or leaders to come and say that this is the direction that we're going to take, this is what we're going to do, and we need to trust, and we need to have leaders that we can trust, and leaders who are willing to lead in the first place. I do think there's a bit of a shortage of that in Singapore, and for a variety of factors, if you want to get into that.
Yeah, I'm still waiting for Singapore Bernie Sanders, honestly. So that's still my hope and dream to see that one day. Santosh and Ongsu, maybe you want to jump in. I actually feel that with what he just mentioned, we could segue into his work at Beyond Social Services, but perhaps you guys just jump in a little bit first.
Yeah, I think for me, it's I'm just reflecting on my own personal experience in the civil service and with discrimination or abuse or harassment, and the mechanisms that are in place for redress. And one, which is the whistleblowing policy, which actually does not really work. And then in MOM, you've got TAFAP, which is also another platform for whistleblowing and for addressing workplace harassment. And in my encounters with these tools which are set up, these are channels, they're formal channels that are set up within the public service and within MOM's TAFAP. I mean, the best way to describe it is a quote by Audre Lorde. So, for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And so this is what the master has designed, right? The master's designed a tool, which is a grievance channel or a whistleblowing channel. Yeah, but it's according to the master's own rules of the game. And no matter what you ask the master to do on your behalf for change, it will never work. Yeah. And one tool that the master will never allow is the tool for mass strike or mass action. Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head by saying that actually we need to exercise that lever, that very lever, which is a mass strike or a demonstration of the collective. Yeah, anything else that is designed by the very master for the servants, it will never work. So that's just my own personal experience. Yeah.
Yeah. I hear the Audre Lorde quote quite a bit, but I also want to provide another layer to that, and it's something Lenin said before, which is that the bourgeoisie produces its own grave diggers, right? And I think that's a interesting insight, because it's I mean, I'm not saying to smash capitalism or anything like that, but I think the insight here is that the master sometimes makes mistakes, right? And sometimes there are or rather not mistakes, but sometimes there's a dual effect to what is being produced, and sometimes those can also lead to its demise. So for me personally, like what I find, I mean, when we talk about oppression, right? Talk about racial oppression, especially. Firstly, okay, so for me, like, identifying the oppressor is the first act of political education, social political education. Who is the oppressor? Because some and I don't want to go into tangent here, but I just want to leave a note on that. Like, it's just some people think that, oh, it's especially minorities, like we think, oh, okay, Chinese people are the aggressors, right? Or then some people say, no, the state are aggressors. Some people say, no, capitalism is the aggressors. So I think political education is important for us to identify the right, who is actually the oppressor. So that's just one thing I want to say. But I think where racial oppression is concerned, like what are the what are the grave diggers, right, of racial oppression in some ways? And I think I don't know enough about the TAFAP scheme. I do know that whenever we talk about discrimination in the workplace, there is unfair dismissal. There is that law that we can use in the Employment Act, but it's never been proven effective. And I also want to explore I know a lot of people tend to write off NTUC a lot, the union, right? In that, because it is an appendage of the state, so can it really represent workers' grievances? I don't know, and I think a lot of it is because we don't know a whole lot about it. And I'm quite curious to know whether unions have tried addressing racism and so on. And I do think that there is like racial oppression, especially, is a class issue. I mean, it is part of a class issue. I think there's a tendency, I think, not just in Singapore, but like in the US, in so many other countries, to pit race against class and say like one matters more than the other. I'm still trying to figure out what I think about it. But I do think that, for one, racial differentiation, racial discrimination it is a labor abuse in a lot of ways, because it actually affects all workers. It just affects the minorities a lot more, because it reduces the collective bargaining power of labor when you start creating tiers of labor. We already create tiers of labor in other ways, right? For example, if you write Grab, there is the Emerald, there is the Sapphire, there's the Ruby kind of tiers, and you have that. But if there's racial discrimination, then there is another form of tiers, and we have it in terms of nationality as well, right? So that's one way of keeping the bargaining power of workers low. But I also think that there is racial oppression that exists outside of labor grievances per se, and trying to liberate minorities from racial oppression should be part of any program for workers of liberation, or any kind of liberation. I'm just not sure if I'm sorry, I can't address your question very well, because I don't know how effective those mechanisms are. My belief is that I don't think there's been any like study on how effective they are. I wouldn't think that they're very effective, just based on the makeup of TAFEP, for example, the sort of tripartite kind of understanding of the capital and labor relations and the state relations. But there is the government has agreed to an anti-discrimination law, right? And it's I'm looking forward to that. I don't think it is the silver bullet for sure, but I'm interested to see how it's applied, because this was something that when I was in Cape, we brought up to I won't name who it is, but one of the MPs who is also an NTUC member, right? And then someone in the NTUC leadership. And it was a very interesting discussion, because when we were talking about the anti-discrimination law, his rebuke was that he asked us whether we jaywalked, and then we said yes, we jaywalked. Then he said, you see, you can have a law against jaywalking, but why? But the law still doesn't work. We were just very flummoxed by that question, because just like, wait, so what's the point of any law, right? Right. So it was just a very unsatisfactory answer. But you see, like, I mean, it's been a year or two since then. I think it's been 2 years since then, and now we have anti-discrimination law. So actually, a lot of it's political will, and it's about when. And I think a lot of it, credit has to be passed, I think, to the anti-racist activism. I think, like in highlighting how discrimination has been such a big issue, and finally they go for the low-hanging fruit, and racial discrimination, a law against racial discrimination is a low-hanging fruit. It's not going to solve racial discrimination for sure. I think that the solution to actually addressing racial discrimination goes back to the first spell I said I wanted to break, which is collective action. I do think that people need to talk about their pay a lot more in workplaces. I think people need to talk about not just in the realm of the workplace, but in what we call social reproduction, housing, in access to welfare, so many of these things. There housing, there is racism. I mean, tenant racism is not as an Indian person, I don't look forward to having to rent property at all. I really don't look forward to it. I just hear so many bad experiences, and so, like, on all these fronts, like, you do need some sort of collective action. Like, even with tenants, tenants can come together to share, like, you know, when there are these abuses, and then they like, there is a role that tenants with, I guess you can say, privilege, to come and say, hey, you know, like, you get a pretty good deal to me, why can't you do the same for this person who has an Indian sounding name? You know, there is, I think, that kind of solidarity, that kind of collective action is what I think will really address racial discrimination. We can't rely on, I mean, like what you said about Audre Lorde's quote, we can't rely on the state to provide it for us. But at the same time, like if you would take Lenin's insight on the grave diggers of capitalism, and we should also, like, I think, look at the master's tools with some form of opportunism, I guess, and like some form of okay, how do we capitalize on this, right? And to not completely reject existing mechanisms. That's all what I'm saying. Yeah.
Well, I think another quote we like to bandy around here is Buckminster Fuller's quote about to change something, just build something new that makes the old system obsolete. And yeah, that's making me think, like, what could we build that makes racism obsolete? I don't know. That's a fantastical thought. But yeah, I just want to give some reflections on stuff you said earlier before I let Douglas segue to research. On the issues of things like strikes and whistleblowers and protests, and one narrative that I really would love to challenge is just the idea that these are all disruptions, and that's how the mainstream likes to frame them. But when in fact the biggest disruptive force in our lives is capitalism, and these are just different ways of helping, the collective bring attention to it. And I just want to go back to that polarity between conversation and action. I think a lot of action is driven towards, and I don't know if I'm quoting you accurately, I think you said something about the effervescence of the collective. And I really love that phrase. I mean, that's what I would love to experience as well. And I think that's why, action drives us to that. But then once the effervescence is over, then there's the ongoing work of balancing power. And that's where I find the power of conversation. Because I think conversation, the true depth and richness of conversation is reciprocity, is when people converse well, there's give and take. And it's an ongoing practice in reciprocity. And so I think after the effervescence is over, like we have to fall back on this ongoing practice of mutual respect. So yeah, that's just my brief reflection on everything you've said.
Yeah, if I can respond to that a little bit, I do agree that after the effervescence, what happens, right? And actually, there's a very one thing I've been thinking about and just jotting down notes on is the food delivery riders' resistance against the PMD ban. So the personal mobilized devices, is that what PMD stands for? Yeah. So yep. those. So I mean, just for the benefit of your viewers, just want to explain what happened. So the PMD, they were banned. It was banned overnight, and a lot of food delivery riders, I mean, henceforth I'll call them riders, riders on your Grab, Food Panda. I don't think Deliveroo was in Singapore at that time. This 2019, and all these. It was banned overnight, and a lot of people were very, very incensed about it, and they stormed meet the people session, and they basically said, and they were demanding that the ban be reversed, and they were actually holding their members of parliament accountable, and I thought that was a moment of collective effervescence. But at the same time, what happened after it, right? The ban didn't get reversed, and there was a speakers corner event that a political one of the opposition political parties tried to organize. It was quite a failure because very few people turned up, and even the riders themselves didn't buy into the way it was being sold, and they sensed this sense of opportunism on their issues, and that there was this sort of politicking that was going on that they didn't want to be a part of, and I thought that was a very good lesson to learn about action and what happens after the action. So firstly, I don't think it was a failure at all, because what the riders did, they got a pretty generous support. I mean, I wouldn't say generous, but they got a compromise. And that wouldn't have happened if there was no action. I mean, yes, the riders, if they had wanted to reverse the ban, we could be very, very critical and realize that, oh, you could have done this, you could have done that. But let's face it, like, nobody, I think, has thought about storming the MPS as a collective. That was genius. I think that was amazing. Like, no civil society literature in a way, it was Rodin's like mode of participation framework. They turned Meet the People session from an individualized, it is meant to be an individualized form of administration, and they turned it into collective. They made it into a freaking town hall. Like, so that interaction with space that was going on, that the writers just turned it, and it was completely legal, right? You could do nothing against them, right? It was not a strike. It was just them exercising their power as a collective, and they were motivated by a certain sense of spontaneity. In a lot of like labor organizing language, it's called a hot shop, right? A hot shop is when there's like one issue that really enrages people, but a hot shop has pros and cons, and you see one of the pros is that it's easy to mobilize. The con is that it is very easy to evaporate after that, and it's true. That's what happened. It evaporated. And that's, I mean, I can talk a lot about like the effects of that event and what happened after that. You got the NDCA that formed, the National Delivery Couriers Association that formed under the NTUC, which I think is a reaction to, okay, we can't have riders doing this all the time. We need to have them in a union so we can keep them in check. But at the same time, the union is actually doing some things that are actually helpful. Like they are interacting with the MOM that has convened a committee to address riders' grievances and all that. And I think it would be good to engage with that and try to ensure that you have certain policies in place, like insurance, for example, and maybe the option to have CPF and pensions. So those are some things that but you see, the interpretation is important. Like someone or leadership, right, among the riders to say that we didn't fail, right? Let's buck up and let's do this. We need to find a way to consolidate the power we have just reached. And I think that power, to me, it's not just about conversation. Conversations are important for sure. But I think conversations need to be rooted in a form of organization, right? I think organizations are important. Like when I think that's why unions have been powerful. Like they're meant to be powerful, and there's a reason why people are scared of unions, and why ultimately like capital is very, very scared of unions, and they're very scared of the kind of power that workers have in unions. Because unions, at least in law, right? I mean, if you have union rights, you can't get fired for being in a union or doing stuff that is completely legal within the union. But I think before we talk about unions and all that, and there is a whole other analysis that has to go in when we talk about NTUC. I think what the writers, I don't think that it is something that they should have done or something like that. I don't think it's my place to say, but I do think that having an organization would have consolidated the gains, and it would have allowed them to sort of like prepare for the next battle, because there are going to be many battles. Like currently there's a vaccination thing that's going on, that there's this they have to test before they, like, I think it's slowly being pushed out. And there are some like issues with like, oh, how come private hire car drivers have a different, they can self-test, but for riders have to go in person to the swap centers to do it. And that's like at a time that they may not be free, and they're kind of like forced to go there, and then the flexibility of work is currently not there anymore. And so it's definitely not going to be the first issue, right? So that kind of, I mean, the PMD ban was just one issue. It's definitely not going to be the first issue. So I think what was missing was an organization, like for them to organize, to consolidate those gains and say that, okay, we continue to have this, we have this leadership, and this leadership will be responsible for ensuring that when the next crisis hits, we're better able to address it. Well, and like do sort of like a critical review, like what happened, that kind of stuff. And that kind of stuff happens over time, right? And so I think to keep collective effervescence there, to keep that collective desire for collectivity, organizations are very, very important. I think like how those organizations work, how they function, like membership requirements, how they make decisions and all that's another thing altogether. But I think principally an organization, I think, is quite important.
Yeah, I just want to drop 2 cents on this ongoing debate that we have, and it's actually becoming even more crystallized between me and Ong Soo in particular, because we just are on different points of view about this idea of conversations making effective mechanisms of change. Like for me, after one of the last sessions I had with Santosh and Ong Soo, like there's something I wanted to say, and now I think I can say it, which is like this idea that Ong Soo brings up about conversations that would be based on reciprocity and give and take, right? I mean, that's the point of the analysis of power, which is there are some agents that will not give and take. There are some agents who will not be reciprocal. And although this seems like a very tangential kind of example, but it's just like what's happening with climate change. You just don't have fossil fuel companies being on the same level of platform as social activism and people who do want to see the reduction of fossil fuels. So even compared to world politicians, like even the fossil fuel executives and companies, they just on this much higher pedestal of power where they don't have to give and take when it comes to making effective climate change policies. So anyway, that's just the point I wanted to make. So in any case, Kumar, let's go on to your work with Beyond. It's definitely something we want to cover. So it's the idea that you've done there's two studies in particular that we want to focus on. So one study that was released somewhere after not after the pandemic, we're still in the pandemic, but it has to do with the effects of the pandemic on low-income families. So that's one. And then the other one, which is much more recent, which is about your study on, I'm reading off the title, Stretch at Work, Stretch at Home. So this pertains to low-income residents who are living in, I assume, rental units and how they're incredibly stretched both at work and at home as well. So, I'd like you to just maybe give a brief summary, as to what are some of the key findings we can talk about.
Yeah, sure. So the Stretch at Work, Stretch at Home, Thinking Twice Before Seeing Doctor was something that I was a lead author in. The one that you're talking about, I think it's Mind the Chasm, Deepening Inequalities in Singapore. Yep. That was authored by Stephanie Chalk, and I was just a research assistant. So I can talk a bit more about the health one, but I'll be happy to maybe, I can't answer maybe specific questions about the deepening inequality one, but I can answer what I can because I was involved in the research process as well. So the findings for the health study, so firstly, it's a very small study on 50 residents of a particular rental flat neighborhood. And those residents I think they all come from different units. Most of them come from different units, rental flat units. And the findings are, well, it's in the title itself, so I try to make it as concise as possible. The issue is that, so initially we were commissioned to do a research on healthcare competencies of the residents, which connote sort of lifestyle and habits that residents, what are their healthy habits that they have. And there is a sense of connotation that maybe they don't have the right habits. For example, they're not eating healthily, they're not exercising well enough, they're not sleeping enough, and again, it goes back to our agency structure kind of thing, right? And what we found out and it's not very surprising, but the most common themes that came out during the data analysis of the interviews was that it's not that, a lot of them know what is healthy. They know how to eat healthily. They know that they should, that exercising is good for you. They know all these things, right? The issue is that there's still about 40% of the residents that we interviewed all had some sort of chronic illness, right? And the thing is what struck out to me was the different factors that determine the habits that they would have. And so then that's why I changed the discussion from competencies to capacities, because what was clear was that they just simply didn't have the capacity to have that kind of lifestyle. And the reason why is because firstly, they're stretched at work. A lot of workplace exploitation happens. Either they overwork, they are working long hours, and the WHO has published a report to say that working long hours is a serious health risk. A lot of people are working long hours. They are also not paid a lot, and when they're not paid a lot for the kind of work that they do, they don't have enough money to access healthcare. I'll talk about healthcare access in a bit. That's the third part, thinking twice before seeing doctor. And then there's the second part, stretched at home, which gets into a bit of a gendered element, which is the household, right? A lot of caregivers feel a lot of strain having to, for one, not having a lot of financial resources means that they can't easily employ a domestic worker to come and help out with the caregiving labor. a lot of the caregiving labor has been borne by them. It's often women, but there are some single men as well that we interviewed, and they also go through the same thing. And it actually cuts at their sleep. They don't sleep a lot because a lot of them have to work and maintain the household at the same time. One of them said that like if they fall sick, it's like the Titanic. The house feels like the Titanic. Everything is when she's sick, the whole house sinks. Essentially, that's what she's trying to say. And then then thinking twice before seeing doctor. That has a lot to do with healthcare access and the quality of healthcare that they get. When you're a low-income resident in the Class C ward, or when you go to the A&E, and yeah, there's many different factors. So for access wise, you just have a lot of different layers. So one is that most things are not fully subsidized in the healthcare system in Singapore. We do have generous subsidies, but the out-of-pocket is still quite a lot for a lot of families. So that's why they think twice before going to doctor, because they if they can self-remedy, they would rather do that. And the other thing is that it's especially difficult for foreign spouses, right? So in rental flats, you don't have your general work permit holders that live in dormitories or multi-purpose dormitories, or that are domestic workers, but you have LTVP, long-term visit pass holders, or and some other like different types of passes. Usually they marry a Singaporean and then they can live in a rental flat. They marry a Singaporean, they usually have kids, and the kids can be Singaporean as well. So there's this double standard with the kind of healthcare access that these parents get, and the cost is ridiculous. Like we presented this to residents, and like one resident shared that she has like $7,000 to pay for fibroids, right, and the ovaries, just to get her treated. She was in so much pain, and her experience was that and this was during COVID, she was not allowed to. She was not allowed to get treatment until she paid for it. So that's something that we can't write in the report yet, because this came out after the interview. But it's something we're figuring out. Like, we always thought that if you go into, she didn't go into A&E, so maybe that was the issue, right? If she went to A&E, maybe they would have treated her first and then billed her after that. But there is like just so many things that we don't really know about the rights of Singaporean and non-Singaporean people who access healthcare, and it's just ridiculously expensive for non-Singaporeans. For Singaporeans as well, even if there's an out-of-pocket, it's still very, very expensive. And yeah, that's essentially what the report's about. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, like I was wondering if you can just, for our viewers especially, just give some very specific examples about those out-of-pocket expenditure costs. There was one case study you had in the report that was especially egregious. So I'm wondering if you can give some details about that. And of course, I just go straight to the point, which is, what kind of solutions do you envisage should be looked at so that our national healthcare system can address these gaps?
Right. Okay. So like in terms of examples, right? Singapore doesn't have it's not a welfare system, right? And we have the 3Ms framework, but it's the 3Ms like MediFund, MediSave, MediShield. But we also have a lot of other schemes like ElderShield and all that has come about, and it's quite confusing for a lot of members, for a lot of residents, and for that reason, that's why medical social workers are very, very important, because they help interpret the different policies and what residents can do. For examples of out-of-pocket,
I was thinking of the case study. It's a woman, and I think you mentioned epilepsy and dental, and the child has something, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
This was multiple members in the household actually having severe issues.
Yeah. So the case study was about this woman, not her real name, Jess, right? And it doesn't have to do with the healthcare access per se, but it has to do with the quality of the health service she got, right? And she talked about how she has to quote unquote fight with doctors to get the healthcare her children needs in public hospitals, right? So Jess is like a single mother in her 50s. Her daughter has epilepsy. Her son has abscesses and cysts forming in the skin frequently, and she's the children's only caregiver, and she's had many experiences in government hospital, and she herself suffers from diabetes and hypertension. Son has undergone like almost 10 surgeries. Doctors have sort of given up on treating the condition. and a daughter had brain surgery at the age of 9. She urinates when she gets epilepsy, and after which Jess has to change her clothes. And Jess feels like she has to monitor her completely, continuously, like a CCTV camera. The caregiving labor here is I think, a full-time job in itself. And I don't think we found out, but I don't think she has a job. So she's on welfare. And if you look at the kind of like, she has also to prepare very specific meals because there's so many allergies. So that's why she also can't, I think, work. So what happened? I mean, there were a few experiences. So one was at KK Hospital, right? Her daughter had been admitted there when she was 9 years old. She was prescribed 4 types of medications, one of which was nitrazepam. And she visited KKH again when the daughter was 18. And the doctor said there was no stock for nitrazepam. And Jess told the doctor that the daughter won't be able to stand up without this drug, and the condition will worsen. And the doctor simply said, I can't give now. And Jess demanded like for the doctors to gather, and she like banged the table in the meeting room and made a scene, threatened a lawsuit if she did not get the medication. But within 2 hours, Jess received the nitrazepam, right? So the question is like, why was it so difficult? I mean, we had conversations so we also shared these findings with other like healthcare workers and all that. And like one healthcare worker in particular shared that it could be because there's a lot of the distribution of nitrazepam is quite strict, because it's also something that people take to get high. So some people, if you too liberally prescribe it, there is an issue with it. So that could be one reason. But it leaves to be said why the doctor just said he can't give, instead of explaining that issue. And it's quite clear that the daughter has a serious health issue, right? So that's one. The other one was that she had an experience where her daughter had to be brought into the A&E because she had epilepsy. She started to vomit while having fits, and there was no nurse to administer medication, and she was told in the A&E that the doctor was not available on that day. So there is, I think, a lingering question about healthcare capacity itself also. I couldn't get into it in this report, but in a conversation with healthcare workers, we also wanted to talk to them about what could a space look like where we're advocating for patients' rights and healthcare workers' rights. Don't necessarily have to contradict one another, right? What does that kind of space look like, right? Because we were thinking a lot about capacity. I think we see it now with COVID, a lot of our healthcare sector capacity is constrained. And I think a lot of it has to do with policies that have not been updated since SARS, and now we have COVID. And I understand that, like, yeah, we are improving the capacity of our ICUs and all that. But I think the issue also is that not enough people are being attracted to become nurses, for example, because of the labor conditions in it. And the pay is not the best, that the work-life balance is not there either. And many nurses are also leaving the sector. And there are also I don't think we have enough doctors as well. There's also a racial question that we didn't get to talk about in this research, but there's literature on it about medical racism, and sort of tied to the fact that we don't have enough doctors of different ethnicities. A lot of anecdotes, case studies of people who say that doctors refuse to treat them because they can't treat on dark skin, because they're just not able. I don't understand the reason behind it, but it's clear that it's quite it is an issue of medical racism, and I think in the end, like what some patients did was that they had to like find doctors that were Indian to like get the care they needed, and they said like, yeah, this is just a simple skin issue, right? So one other case that Jess had was that a case of undertreatment, and I think this is not very uncommon. Our son had a surgery, and he could not stand and was crying upon getting discharged. And there was just so much pain. Doctor did not prescribe painkillers. And so Jess had to demand to the doctor to give him painkillers before discharging him. And the question is like, if it wasn't someone as outspoken and as militant as Jess at the hospital, what would have happened, right? Would the son have to have suffered in silence? And so there is a lot of actually patients have to advocate for themselves quite a bit in the healthcare sector. So in terms of the quality of healthcare, that's kind of like some of the insights we got. Yeah, but access is a whole other issue also, right? In terms of financial access and so on.
Santosh and Angsu, you want to jump in?
Ansu, do you have got? Yeah, no. So I think for me, Kumar, after hearing your anecdotes and I've read your report as well. Like I mean, for me personally, yeah, the answer is very clear. We need to shift away from the 3M model that you're talking about and just give free universal physical and mental health care for those who need it without any question. Like for me, it just pains me to hear what you just said. And personally, I would lay a bet that if you do an economic cost benefit analysis of the current status quo versus a new model of free universal physical and mental health care, the new model will prove to be a lot more cost efficient and effective. Yeah, because of the tremendous amount of cost that is spent in administrating the 3 different M's, the means testing that is required to assess whether a person deserves subsidy for healthcare or financial assistance. I think it's very clear to me that if you just rebuild another system just based on universal and free healthcare, it will be a lot more efficient, effective, and effective. Yeah. Now, in order to move towards the new model of free and universal healthcare, there are some critics to that. There are some arguments of abuse, freeloading, dependency, or crutch mentality.
Sometimes known as entitlement mentality.
Entitlement mentality, right? Like, yeah. So I want to prepare us for the arguments against free and universal healthcare. Okay, but sorry, I've not even asked anyone here whether you're in favor of a new model of like just universal and free healthcare. I presume that we're all on the same boat. Yeah, but yeah, so I'd just like to have everyone else's thoughts on that and the resistance and what is the counter argument to the resistance that we can offer for a new model if we vote in favor of the new model. So that's, sorry, I jumped the gun a little bit, but yeah, I wanted to have everyone else weigh in on what do you think could be the new system that Dark Minister Fuller would envision that would render the old system obsolete.
So you want to go first? Then
yeah, I'm definitely in favor of some kind of universal healthcare and even further universal basic income. Something my dad, even when I was a kid, he would tell me was like, if you give people free operations, do you think people are going to abuse that? It's like no one wants to have an operation,
Exactly.
like,
Yeah.
And that was a very simple thing that I think there could be tiers of medical treatment, right? So like things like operations, I think it's pretty safe to just pay for everyone who wants one. But there might be certain other elective kind of things that, you definitely wouldn't want to pay for like plastic surgery, right? Necessarily, unless it's like reconstructive. Kumar, thanks for sharing the details of Jess's story. That's so like heartbreaking. And one thing I'm wondering is it enough just to have more programs and subsidies, or do we actually have to go deeper and actually have a complete mindset shift? Because a lot of what is happening is also the way we focus so much on productivity and not as much on care. The simple fact is that as a society, we care more about the productivity of individuals than their well-being. And just to flip those priorities would be huge. And, towards Santosh's question, like, what is the new system? That would be one philosophical difference that I would want to really push for. And I think the other thing that is poignant about what you shared from your research, Kumar, is that like all these health campaigns actually make the problem worse because, it makes them feel guilty that they're not sort of pursuing these healthy things because they don't have the capacity. the fact is they're overworked, sleep deprived, and so you're making the problem even worse by just kind of telling them what they don't even have the ability or the capacity to do. So yeah, those are my reflections.
Okay, I'll just jump in a little bit. So Santosh, I think the problem to me when it comes to advocating a new, like a free and universal healthcare system is that most people aren't really aware of it. So to give you an example, only when I was in Australia, then I came to realize, what a different healthcare system model they had there and how much more, efficient but cheaper and much more accessible it is for everyone. And then, just being back in Singapore, and look, I just want to also put this out there, right? I mean, the four of us are pretty well-educated men who have traveled, in other countries as well. But to give you a real vivid example, like when I, with my current partner, my girlfriend, who's not someone who's traveled very much, like she had no idea what a different healthcare system model would look like. And I would bet you that even for the workers that say Kumar works with, or the low-income people, that they have no conception about what a different healthcare model would look like. And so, like, just as an example for my girlfriend, like I showed her the movie by Michael Moore. It was called, oh shit, the name escapes me right now, but it's a movie where he goes to different countries, and his agenda for making that movie was to show America like how a different healthcare system or a different education system, different policies would work in other countries. And when my girlfriend watched that, like it blew her mind as well. Yes, that's right, Kumar. It's where to invade next. Yeah. So I think we need material like that, because I think people are just not very aware of this to begin with. So that's one issue that we have to contend with. And then the other thing I was going to add on to about the health discussion, right? So I do have a friend who is a nurse, and like in the last, especially given what's happening with the taxing of the healthcare system and the workers in particular, like she's also voiced out very similar views about how they are severely underpaid. It doesn't even make sense for a nurse to look at other people working in other professions, earning so much more money, doing much less health-saving, life-saving tasks and work, and she's down there like risking her life, her health, and she's only earning like very very minimal, especially in the context of Singapore. So it's something that we have talked about in our last session, that we feel very strongly that the pays and the salary of healthcare workers should be raised, just no question asked. Yeah. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is, just because I am a fitness professional, someone who works in the fitness industry, I had a conversation with my client before, and it was something that has also struck me, which is when it comes to improving the health of people, especially in this economy that we live right now, it's like the rich that can afford it, because they're the ones who can pay trainers like us. They're the ones who can go to dietitians, nutritionists, afford organic food. And we now live in an economy where it's only the privileged and the well-off that can afford to stay healthy. This author, his name is Raj Patel. He wrote a book some years back called Stuff and Starve, and essentially he analyzes like one of the major issues we have in this economy right now is that the poor are severely malnourished, and that's even if they have access to food, which is like fast food in particular. And I saw pretty much the same trend that you're reporting also in your report, Kumar. And I think this is something that I would like. I think it does necessitate some kind of overhaul of the system, so that the poor do not feel like they have to pay a lot of money just in order to stay healthy.
Yeah, I also agree that we should have a universal healthcare system in terms of coverage as well. So it has to be free. And yeah, I totally agree with Unsu, your dad. Yeah, who's gonna want to get more operations, right? And I guess it's maybe it's the case in private healthcare facilities where they kind of expect I don't know if you're class A. I mean, not class A, but I think if you're in a very high up ward, you just get this sort of luxury treatment or something like that. But I don't think people are gonna. And there's medical tourism, right? So there is that phenomenon, but I don't think it's something that the poor or the working class strives for, like to just be in the hospital, and yeah. So I think actually the onus is on defenders of the non-welfare model to prove that this actually does happen. And it's actually a lot of there are a lot of spells, right, that we've been told since our social studies lessons that, well, if you compare to the British NHS, the National Healthcare System, Singapore's model is far superior. But the thing about the NHS is that what they don't share in our textbook is that, yes, they do have long waiting times and all that, but that's because the Tories, the Conservatives, have been cutting funding from the NHS for years. They've been trying to deplete the healthcare sector. And the issue is that actually more funding would help. It would have helped. And the other thing is also just, I think, our ideology about having budget deficits, right, in the government sector. Because I think one shift is the neoliberal shift in policy, in policy making and public administration, right? In Singapore, we kind of changed our administration to one that became more decentralized and focused on saving costs, right? If I'm not wrong, I think it's called line budgeting. My public administration literature is like not in my head right now, but what I do remember is that the kind of budgeting is that the ministry that, and maybe Douglas, you can correct me, because if you in the civil service, right, you can add on to this. It's like if you're a sector, if your ministry sort of like manages to save cost, then you would get more funding. The more cost you save, the more funding you would get the next year or something. And that ideology can't be expanded to all ministries. Things like healthcare, I think it needs to fit with the times. It needs to address what is the healthcare capacity of the country, and we need to be okay with that, with having a deficit for healthcare, right? And taxation is another thing. Our taxation, the ideology behind our taxation policies is not pragmatic at all. It's very ideological. It is that we tax the poor. We essentially, yes, I mean, it's a tax on everybody, but it disproportionately affects the poor much more. We raise GST, we raise petrol taxes, we raise so many other things, right? Housing costs as well as high, but fair enough, that's not a tax, right? But we have so many other different types of taxes, but we don't have even a single percentage of wealth tax. We don't even have a single percentage of estate duties tax, right? And that's why billionaires from China are fleeing China and coming here instead, because the Chinese government is actually going hard on their billionaires. For us, billionaires are coming here. And I think that's another spell that I want to break also, which is that why do we worship billionaires so much, right? And the whole thing, I mean, this is also going back into racial politics a little bit. The CECA, right? The SICA, the Indian Free Trade, the Singapore-India Free Trade Agreement has been in the limelight for a very long time, and it's been used as a bogeyman to a scapegoat to say that this is our labor issues. We are having too many Indian workers coming to Singapore, and because of that, we're not having enough jobs, and the Singaporean working class is under siege, right? And I just think that's not true, because, and it's just very fascinating to me that we look at foreign labor as parasites, but we look at like foreign capitalists as like bastions of wealth creation, when they don't actually create wealth. They hoard wealth, right? They extract wealth from the labor that creates it. So that is just baffling to me. And I guess it's a spell that we need to break out of. Why do we actually think billionaires produce value? Like, yes, they have power in the sense that they have capital. They come here, and capital is needed to employ labor and all that, but capital doesn't accumulate and generate itself if labor is stagnant. Labor needs to move. Labor needs to make $5 into $10, right? And that just is not thought about. And yeah, I just find it so fascinating. Like the billionaires got. I mean, and if you read Stephanie Chop's Deepening Inequality paper, there's one section where she talks about the how inequality has deepened when you look at how billionaires have gotten richer during the pandemic, and how the average Singaporean, and if you look at our report, well, there is a gauge about how the poorer Singaporean has gotten poorer, right? And if you look at the billionaires, look at the list of billionaires, a lot of them are not Singaporean as well, right? So it's just, I mean, I don't think we should go after people's nationalities. I don't think so at all. I just think that it's interesting that nationalism in Singapore and the xenophobia manifests in a very anti-labor kind of way and not an anti-capital kind of way, right? And I think that's very telling of the kind of like system and common sense that we are in. And I think we all drank the Kool-Aid when we were all in school that foreign investments bring in jobs and all that, which is true. It does bring in jobs, yes, but it doesn't accumulate wealth. It is labor that accumulates the wealth that capital brings in, right? And the thing is, and the thing we talk about a lot is that labor strikes are illegal. Labor can't, I mean, they can if they're in a union and all that, but let's not forget the fact that most foreign workers are in construction, the work permit holders and all that, they're not in the unions. And even if they're in unions, there is another layer of nationalism in the unions where a lot of collective bargaining agreements don't accord the same rights to non-Singaporeans. They can't, labor can't strike, but capital strikes all the time. It strikes all the time. They strike by leaving the country, by saying that, okay, well, we're going to close shop here. I think there was a recent capital withdrawal. I can't remember what it was. Was it Panasonic? I think I can't remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, Panasonic. And that threatens jobs as well. So capital does that kind of strike, but labor is not allowed to strike. So it's clearly ideological. It's not purely like non-ideological pragmatism or anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say, yeah, that's definitely one spell that I'm definitely hard at work at breaking. And I think that when it comes to billionaires, I mean, just to point this out, just the other day, Elon Musk made 36 billion in one day, just one day alone. And I think people really misunderstand and don't comprehend like how much how do first billionaires make their wealth? It's not through productivity and labor. It's not because they're working 36 billion times harder than you. A lot of it comes from obviously their investments, and it's just passive income that's streaming through the investments that they make. And further to that, like I think in terms of what you were saying, Kumar, in Singapore in particular, it's the idea of meritocracy. It's the idea that we are still under the spell that when we see a successful millionaire or billionaire, it's because it's through some sheer ingenuity, intelligence, or pure hardworkingness that makes up for their wealth. When the truth is that it's nothing to do with that, and as you mentioned, it's primarily have to do with exploitation of their labor and the surplus profit that they generate from other economic activities. So we got a little bit more time left, and I just kind of thought to move it a little bit ahead. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, Kumar, but both of you, please feel free to jump in with your own questions as well, because you also talk about activism, right? And you've been involved in, like, say, working for home. So I'm just wondered if you can share some observations about the social activism scene in Singapore and whether anything can be done to, improve its acceptance and normacy. But the other two, please feel free to jump in with some questions.
Maybe I'll just tag on my own question to that, which is on a similar theme. Like, I'm just curious, like, when you look at the activism or advocacy scene in Singapore, who are the ones that you really admire and look up to as doing great work?
Sure. Yeah, those are great questions. Doug, your question is how to make activism more, what again, sorry?
Just more normalized. Yeah.
Normalized by the layperson.
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, I think I wish I can remember the study that was. I can't remember I can't remember what kind of rigorous study it was, but definitely a couple of months ago, definitely within this year, there was news coverage about how Singaporeans in general felt towards activism, cancel culture, woke culture, whatever you want to rephrase it as, and I think on the bright side, I think it was a little bit, compared to previous surveys, I think it was kind of leading up. So I guess people are coming more to terms that activism has an important role to play, but that's probably led by the younger generation. So it's still very much the older generation that still view these activities with disdain. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that I mean, as somebody who co-organized a festival called Activism in Crisis, there's a double meaning to that. Like we're kind of mobilizing during a time of crises, right? COVID-19 is one. The 2008 financial crisis was one, and then we had the climate crisis, and we probably will have many financial crises on its way. And it's the age of crisis, right? And so we are mobilizing around during that time, and which gives this sense of urgency that we need to get things right. We need to or not necessarily just get things right, but we need to like do stuff, right? We need to like start doing all the things that we kept theorizing in our heads, and just get to work, right? Then the other part is that activism in itself is in crisis, in a sense that there is some crises within how we wage activism, how we do it and stuff like that. And I say that as somebody who has engaged in activism, right? And somebody who has who gets involved in some of these spaces. So for me, I think like activism in Singapore has really like proliferated a lot, and I think maybe a definition of activism might be helpful in how I see it, right? So there is, and yeah, so this again goes like civil society, left, and everyone else kind of distinction that we make, right? And I think this is a helpful distinction to make sometimes, but sometimes it's not, because activism is an act itself. Activism is because the left, civil society, those are nouns, right? And I mean, activism is also a noun, but those are sort of like membership type of things. Like, okay, you're part of civil society, you're part of the left, but you can't be part of activism. Activism is kind of a process. Who's really involved in activism? Who is a whole other thing. So activism is a process. I prefer to see activism as a process rather than an organization or a these are the people in activism kind of thing. So I prefer to see activism as a process, and I find that allows me to think about how to expand activism, how can activism proliferate even further. And I think in that regard, you have civil society that has expanded in numbers. I would say the left, there is a burgeoning left. I would say I don't think there was a left per se. There were like leftist people. I don't think there was a left in Singapore. I can't really have, like 5 years ago or something like that. I think there was a left that was forming, it was burgeoning. And I think and what's the difference between civil society and the left? Okay, so civil society, I would say, okay, and this is not backed by any scholarship, right? But I mean, it's backed by some scholarship, which is that some scholars in Singapore write about civil society a lot, and they look at different thinkers, Western thinkers' conception of civil society. Gramscian definition of civil society, Tocquevillian definition of civil society, Hegelian definition of civil society. I don't think that's relevant for this discussion, but what I want to say is that civil society is a broader thing, a broader umbrella, and civil society means that you're kind of involved in some engagement with the state, and you're not directly a part of the state, but I think especially in Singapore, you cannot see it as a state and non-state kind of thing, because the state is so pervasive. So of course, by that logic, then Beyond is not part of civil society either, because Beyond is a VWO, and a VWO is still under the state's control in a lot of ways. So and you can even look at Home and say that it's not even part. It's not part of civil society if you go by that definition, because Home has funding from the state for some things. So you have to look at civil for it to be a helpful definition in the way that people are using it in Singapore. We have to see civil society as a very expansive label, and I think it incorporates people of different ideologies, people of from as far as the right to the far left, right, and people who are even like more pro-state, right? You have people who argue that you need to reform within the state. You need to find a way to get into the PAP and then like advocate change within the dominant party. You have people who go into the civil service and say that, oh, you have to advocate change within that, and then they engage with civil society and stuff like that. I would say actually they are part of civil society, right? And I would say that civil society also includes, of course, your more independent groups like Home, TWC2, your groups like Transformative Justice Collective, New Narrative, all these different groups. I think they're all part of civil society. Then there are civil society activists, right? Kirsten Han, right? Kokila Anamale, Jolovan Wham, a lot of other outspoken activists also in the environmental scene, right? The Weird and the Wild does a lot of infographics that help educate people. Minority Voices is also something that I think is part of civil society. Very, very huge definition. CAPE is also part of it, right? Then there's the left. The left, I would say, it's a smaller part of civil society that is not quite apart from civil society, and it interacts a lot with civil society. And the left is, I don't want to name organizations, or don't want to name people without asking whether you're okay with identifying as the left. But I think there are some organizations that are more ideologically left-leaning, and they tend to be saying things like, okay, we need systemic change, we need structural change, right? And those are a bit different from civil society groups. They might say that, but they don't really practice it per se. For example, I don't think home is part of the left. I don't think so, right? I don't think home is part of the left. Like, they may have leftist people inside, they may have leftist ideas, but if you look at the organization itself, if you look at the structure of it itself, I don't think it's leftist, right? But there are people inside it who are leftist, I would say, and they're trying to engage with things, and there isn't a neat separation between a lot of organizations in civil society and the state, and so by that definition, the left is very small, right? It's very, very small, very, very tiny. And
sorry, Kumar, can I just ask you to clarify what you mean by the left? Is it just people who believe in an alternative system to capitalism, or is it a belief in socialism specifically? Yeah.
I think I would say that it is critical of capitalism, and not. You have left liberal, right? They argue that capitalism can be reformed. Capitalism sucks, but it can be reformed. Capitalism has certain aspects of it that can be reformed. So I think they can be incorporated as the left. You want to say maybe the left liberal, but I think for the purpose of discussion, I think I'm looking at like people who are more critical of capitalism as a system in itself, and like seeking to replace it with something else. Some people suggest degrowth, some people suggest socialism, some people suggest Marxism, some people suggest communism, right? Some people suggest anarchism. So I think that would be the left. So I guess by my definition of the left, but I do think it's useful to look at the liberal left as well, right? I think you have a lot of more outspoken liberal left, because the space for liberal left ideas is a lot more palatable in Singapore, right? You have a lot of economists in Singapore that are liberal left, for example. So then where I see activism and the state of activism is that there is a sort of like interaction between the left and civil society and the way that they work with the state. But then there's also the very important there's a very important category of that needs to be concerned: the crowd, right? The crowd, the public, and the crowd and the public gets involved in activism all the time, right? And they have to be involved in activism in order for activism to be effective, right? So you have the riders, for example. So another section is the workers. The workers are not part of the left. A lot of workers are not part of the left. That's a problem for the left, but that's also a problem that the left around the world has had for a very long time, where the labor movements have not been part of the left. And this is because of a lot of history with the left after the crackdowns and all that. And there's this separation between social movements and labor movements. Recently, there's been a bit of a revival in other parts of the world. And I think in Singapore, we see some parts of this also. They try to reconnect some of these things. So labor movement is a social movement, right? And so connecting with workers, connecting with the lay person, that's very important. In my opinion, at least my perspective as a 27, I'm 27, right? Yeah, I'm 27, I keep forgetting. As a 27-year-old growing up in Singapore, is that I sort of saw a disconnect. Like, maybe there was a lot going on behind the scenes, but there was a bit of a disconnect between workers organizing and like the kind of riders. I mean, for example, I don't think any leftist activists or anybody was connecting with the riders when that whole thing happened. I don't think that was happening. If it did, like, please let me know. But I don't, as far as I know, nobody was connecting with them, and no groups really connected with them. And I think activism is expanded in that regard, because I think activists are starting to conceive of themselves as workers as well, and that they are also in workplaces that this actually happens and stuff like that. And that I think there is this merging of social and labor going on. And I think for that reason, activism, the space for activism has expanded. And this is despite a lot of mechanisms that make activism very difficult to do, like the FICA, right? The FICA law that creates some obstacles towards collaboration with people overseas, especially when we're trying to address issues like what's happening in Myanmar, for example, right? Activists have to think like 2, 3, 4 times to get a legal opinion on whether like they can invite a Myanmar activist to share about what's going on in Myanmar. So you have this. I'm sorry, I'm going to be long-winded, right? Can I explain one other concept? It's by Spinoza that I think might be helpful.
Sure.
Is this distinction between potestas and potentia, right? So Spinoza talks about. What I like was this book by Rodrigo Nunes called Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, A Theory on Organization. So he talks about, they talk about, they use Spinoza and apply it to leftist politics and just activism in general. And they say that activism always is always feeling that they have a lack of capacity. Right, and the reason why he thinks is because if you look at Spinoza's concept, potestas is something that the state has, the ruling classes have. Potestas is what they can wield at you with the snap of a finger, right? The police, the different state mechanisms, the law, so many of these mechanisms they can use against the layperson, right? And then potentia, and potestas are always very strong. Potentia is the potential that the collective has. It's always nestled that's deep within that. It's always there, but it needs to be activated. But it will always be very hard to activate that because there's so many people and so many different complications, and it's just a broader pool of things, right? And engaging that kind of potential is what is the challenge, in my opinion. Like, how do you engage the kind of potential against the protesters? So the protesters, I would say, is your FICA, your POFMA, all these different laws, contempt of court, Public Order Act, all these different laws that actually just put protesters, making it harder and harder for potential to be realized. But I think actually the space for potential has increased because a lot of these acts of protesters, I thought my physics is horrible, but there is this Newton law, right, about like, when you hit something with a force, there's always an equal force coming back. I always think that that's always interesting when you think about labor movements. The Great Depression was a great source of radicalization for a lot of workers. In the US, it actually created what we know as the AFL-CIO, the very, at that time at least, a very militant coalition of labor groups that tried to win gains against their bosses. And right now we have COVID-19, which is also seeing a lot of it's basically a standpoint for a lot of different inequalities to manifest, like how migrant workers are treated at dormitories, for example, right? And also just workers are being laid off so easily, despite the fact that actually the companies have a lot of money. Exxon is a perfect example for that. So all these things, I think, creates a lot of potential for capacity of the collective to increase. The question is, how do activists seize that opportunity? What do they do with that? How are they learning that? Right? That is always the challenge. So in my opinion, I think those things are happening. I do think that it's very exciting. I think there's a lot of potential, and it's a work in progress. It's too early to tell, but I do think that the space has increased. Surprisingly, I mean, maybe some might disagree with me because the state is doing all these things, right? But I tend not to focus on that. I tend to focus on how we're responding to it. Right, and what are people doing in response to that? And I think like a petition came out in like a matter of few days, 20 plus organizations signed it. I mean, just can you think about that 10 years ago, where that 20 plus organizations signing a statement against a law like that? Unthinkable. I think the space is expanded. Yeah.
Angsu wanted you to address whether you have anyone that you find inspirational.
Oh yeah, plenty. I get inspired by so many people all the time. In the activist scene, is it? In the activist scene, well, I guess for me personally, I invited PJ Thum and Kirsten Hunt to come to college to speak to students about new narrative and just like, you know, democracy and things like that. And I think that was, my first sort of exposure. And I think I was very inspired by PJ in particular because I initially wanted to join academia, And then I saw like, oh wow, why did he leave academia? So silly boy, why did he do that? Go to Oxford and he leave, like my mother would scold him. so that was what I was thinking. But I think like finding out like why he did what he did was very inspiring. And actually, yeah, we invited him before that select committee. And after that select committee, the way he was treated in the media and all that was just very, very sad to see. And I was doing student exchange in Netherlands at that time, and I felt very powerless. Like, oh, what can we do? There's somebody we invited. Our students know him, and we were just trying to galvanize support and people to write things online, to say things, and yeah, it was just very sad to see. But it also was a very educational moment for me. And then I went and interned at home after that, and that's where I met Jolovan. I met so many others. Javon is another person. I met Stephanie Chalk as well. Javon Ng, I don't know whether you know Javon Ng, but Javon Ng is somebody that not people talk about, but I think he's actually very, very, he's like one of the best organizers I know, like because he doesn't take care of himself enough. Like if Javon, you're watching this, you don't take care of yourself enough, but he knows that, right? But he really goes the extra mile for the migrant workers that he works with, and I think that's why a lot of migrant workers have a lot of respect for him. So one worker actually drew a whole portrait of him, and I thought that was quite amazing, right? And what I like about Javon was that he actually made space while he was in home, and like wherever he is, he always made space to bring migrant workers together to have a meal and talk about their workplace issues. And I thought that was, to me at that time, I didn't think that was organizing. I just thought that was, oh, okay, this is an interesting thing to do on Sunday, right? And I realized like after that, I was like, wow, okay, this is actually really powerful stuff, right? So yeah, and yeah, Jolovan for like all the work he's done for not just migrant workers justice, but like I think just for all of us to have a conscience in Singapore. I think like he puts his body on the line a lot, and I think one thing I really respect about Jolovan is that he's very humble, and he's very, very approachable, right? And yeah, Dr. Stephanie Chalk also like for like my first foray into like research-based kind of work, and her research was really powerful for me. And I was like looking at, I remember going to internships and then looking at, I was like, wow, I would like to do that as a full-time job, right? If you just do research on this kind of issues, like that sounds okay. And then next thing you know, I'm working with her, right? So that's quite a dream come true. And there's so many others, like Kokila as well. Kokila Anamale is like a huge inspiration for like, how she thinks about the community organizing as a really important mode of activism, I think. And I think she's also has a lot of experience that I learned from. And yeah, just the way she also like relates different issues together, like incarceration, race, capitalism, class. It's just really like something to marvel at. So yeah, those are some activists I really get. I admire a lot of my peers as well. But yeah, I don't know how public they want to be. So I shouldn't pauto them lah. Yeah.
Santosh, you want to get one last word in before we wrap up? Okay.
No, I'm good. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. So look, we've reached the ending of our session. So thanks a lot, Kumar. Really, it's been really educational, enlightening, and I really have to say the three of us, I guess we wouldn't consider ourselves activists. So look, we thank you really for your work and your spirit and enthusiasm, that undying spirit to just keep working on these issues. And obviously all the names that you've mentioned, we're incredibly grateful to have people like that within our midst and our community. And I think for me, my takeaway message here for anyone who's listening really is that we do need that spirit of solidarity. I mean, these people cannot continue their work if we don't support them as well. And that's at least what I think as a channel we are trying to do here by broadcasting and airing their views, so that if you're out there, you're wondering what you can do, to help the marginalized, the poor, you have to listen to voices like this, and not always from the state. Angsu, you want to have some closing thoughts?
Yeah, no, thanks for joining our show, and really enjoyed the conversation. I think one phrase that will really stick with me is collective effervescence. I didn't realize, but the shirt that I wore today is actually strangely appropriate. I think that actually is an image of collective effervescence. So, maybe it's because of the, being in a pandemic and all the social restrictions, but I'm personally yearning for some collective effervescence myself. So let's hope we get there. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, so if that's it, thanks everyone for watching, and we hope to see you in the next one. Thanks, Kumar.
Thank you so much for having me.